Great, thanks, Susan. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. This is Jeremy Maestas with USDA's Natural Resources Conservation Service. I'm going to be summarizing the content from our chapter in the Sagebrush strategy on conifer expansion. I want to quickly acknowledge the other collaborators on that chapter: Dave Noggle, University of Montana; Gene Chambers, Forest Service; Jason Tack with the Fish and Wildlife Service; Chad Boyd, ARS; and Joe Tagg, just recently retired with the BLM. Okay, so I'm just going to start with a brief summary on the nature and extent of the conifer expansion problem, why it matters and what we can do about it, current efforts to address the expansion issue, and then seed some ideas for discussion for next week's breakout sessions on future needs to address the challenge. Next slide. For a little bit of perspective, I think it's important to back up and acknowledge that native trees are expanding into grass and shrublands around the world. In North America, expansion of conifer woodlands and forests are impacting rangelands from the Great Basin to the Great Plains. This includes primarily species like pinyon pine and juniper in the sagebrush biome, but also other conifers like Douglas fir. 2 to 6-fold increases in pinyon juniper woodlands have been documented in the Great Basin since the late 1800s, with about 90% of that expansion having occurred in adjacent sagebrush ecosystems. The causes are not well understood, but have been primarily attributed to favorable climate conditions and reduced fire occurrence. Next slide. While most conifer expansion occurred in a pulse in the past, really during the late 1800s to early 1900s, this isn't just a historic problem. Woodland change continues today. Conifer woodlands are both expanding into new areas and infilling or getting thicker in areas of previous expansion. In fact, the area considered to be forested by pinyon juniper cover in the Great Basin increased over 1.1 million acres at a rate of about 0.5% per year just in the last couple decades in this region. Next slide. Now I want to clearly acknowledge that pinyon juniper woodlands are diverse and important native ecosystems in their own right. They occupy about 100 million acres in the western U.S., making it about the 3rd largest vegetation type. And they exist in a variety of conditions, supporting different vegetation types from sparsely treed savannas to wooded shrublands and persistent historic woodlands. Woodland change is occurring all along this continuum of different moisture and climate conditions. And that includes infilling of those historic pinyon juniper sites and a woodland expansion and infill that is contributing to the imperilment of adjacent sagebrush shrublands. And while there are reasons to be concerned about all of these changes, what we're really focused on here is the issue of conifer expansion into historic shrublands and the ensuing woodland succession that takes place. So focus your eye on that red box in this diagram. Next slide. Conifer expansion into shrublands causes a cascade of negative impacts affecting ecosystem function, sagebrush-dependent wildlife, and the rural communities that depend upon those working lands for income. Predictable changes occur as previously treeless shrublands go through the various phases of woodland succession. We see a loss or reduction of shrubs, grasses, and forbs, reduced soil moisture for plant growth, increased risk of high severity fire effects. For example, woody fuel loads can be up to 8 times higher in phase 3 woodlands than treeless shrublands. Overall, this translates into decreased resilience to fire. In other words, the ability to bounce back in a perennial dominated system, and to resist conversion to cheatgrass. Next slide. Our understanding of what these changes mean for sage-grouse in particular has grown tremendously over the last decade. Turns out sage-grouse are sensitive to very low amounts of conifer cover on the landscape. For example, one study in Oregon found no leks, or those strutting grounds, remained active when they had just 4% tree cover in the surrounding area. And while trees are a more natural feature on the landscape, the impacts we're seeing are really tantamount to those observed with other anthropogenic stressors like energy development, subdivision, and cropland conversion. Several studies now show that even before that direct habitat loss occurs, sage-grouse avoid or are negatively associated with conifer cover during all life stages. Next slide. What about other sagebrush species of concern? We have a lot less science, but some evidence shows conifer expansion does result in fewer sagebrush specialist small mammals like pygmy rabbits, Great Basin pocket mouse, and more woodland specialists. Woodland expansion decreases forage availability and quality for big game like mule deer. And long-term population data from the breeding bird survey in the region shows sagebrush songbirds like brewer sparrow are declining, while most of the woodland bird guild, like ash-throated flycatchers, juniper titmouse, gray flycatcher, are all increasing, as might be expected with increasing amounts of PJ woodlands. The notable exception here is pinyon jay, which is a woodland obligate that's associated with sagebrush systems, but its populations are very closely tied to the health and vigor of pinyon pine species. Next slide. To address these impacts, managers implement conifer removal using a variety of methods. Relative to other restoration tools in our toolbox, we actually know a lot about the efficacy of this practice. Outcomes have been well documented for a broad range of ecosystem functions, such as grasses and forbs being maintained or increased, prolonged water availability in the soil, reduced risk of those high-severity fire impacts, and again, improved resilience to fire, resistance to cheatgrass conversion. Of course, as with all land treatments, the degree of efficacy depends on a lot of different factors, including the methods used, site type and conditions, location, and follow-up management. Next slide. Since cheatgrass is a new reality on many of our sagebrush rangelands, it must be considered when planning and implementing any treatments. If cheatgrass is present on a site, it can increase after treatment or wildfire. Fortunately, we've learned a lot about predicting those risks in recent years so we can better mitigate future problems. For example, we now know that cheatgrass risk depends primarily on the site climate and pre-treatment vegetation. Warmer, drier sites are higher risk than cooler, wetter sites. Think lower elevations or south-facing slopes versus higher elevations or north-facing slopes. The abundance of perennial herbaceous plants, especially those deep-rooted perennial grasses, is key at keeping invasive annuals at bay. Higher tree cover on sites results in greater risk of cheatgrass, especially on our warmer, drier sites. This is primarily due to the reduction of perennial grasses associated with woodland succession. Next slide. As we've learned more, restoration of sagebrush ecosystems with conifer removal has become increasingly targeted. It's now common practice to prioritize early phases of invasion for treatment. Think about those phase 1 and phase 2 sites. The goal there being preventing the loss of understory vegetation components like sagebrush and perennial grasses that are hard to reestablish. Treatments are often focused in and around priority sage-grouse habitats. And we're incorporating ecological site potential information and risks of cheatgrass using field guides like the one listed here, the snapshot of Rick Miller and others developed that include resilience and resistance concepts in our decision-making process. Selective techniques for tree removal are much more common today, such as chainsaw and tree shredding, than prescribed fire, which is more of a broadcast treatment. Although all of those tools remain important parts of our toolbox for managing expansion and infill. Next slide. Conifer removal is one of the few restoration options that has actually been shown to benefit sage-grouse. Sage-grouse use treated areas almost immediately following removal, and studies have documented increases in nest, brood, and adult survival. Recently, we now have evidence of population-level benefits of treatment. Olson and others in a big study in Oregon just showed about a 12% increase in population growth rate in treated landscapes versus untreated controls over the same time frame. Examples of population benefits of restoration for any wildlife species are extremely rare, so this finding is significant and encouraging. Next slide. Other species of concern have been shown to respond to conifer removal as well. Abundance of brewer sparrow doubled following mechanical juniper removal in Oregon, and overwinter survival of fawns increased 15% in areas with mechanical treatment and follow-up seeding and weed control in Colorado. Next slide. Sage-grouse have become a primary driver of conifer removal in the sagebrush biome. A recent remote sensing study quantified conifer reduction in sage-grouse range over the last several years. That's the figure shown here on the right. It depicts the relative amount of reduction of conifer cover by state attributed to either management or wildfire, and whether or not that occurred within a sage-grouse priority area for conservation or PAC. In a nutshell, over half of all conifer reduction occurred in sage-grouse packs. Interestingly, wildfire was still found to play a major role in controlling conifer extent in the region, representing about 1/3 of all reductions. We're also seeing several examples of landscape scale cross-boundary restoration emerging over the last decade. For example, partners from BLM, NRCS, state and local agencies, and ranchers in the Warner Mountains, shown here by the inset star on the diagram, have all collaborated across public and private lands to address this expansion challenge across a huge region spanning Oregon, California, and Nevada. And those types of examples are becoming more and more common across the Great Basin and sagebrush biome in general. Land management agencies have reported anywhere from 5 to 14-fold increases in the annual rate of conifer removal in recent years. Next slide. Despite that recent progress, though, the sobering news is that our management may just be keeping pace with expansion and infill. That same remote sensing study documented just a 1.6% reduction in the total conifer cover in sage-grouse range. Remember, this was during what's been called the largest conservation effort in U.S. history. So this really suggests that our current efforts, although very important and on the right track, may just be keeping pace with the rate of expansion that's estimated to be anywhere from 0.5 to 1.5% a year. Next slide. The good news is that it's not too late to act. About 80% of the sites in the Great Basin are estimated to be still in those early phases of invasion, phases 1 and 2. However, most of this is predicted to transition to those dense phase 3 woodlands in the next 30 to 50 years. So we really have a window of opportunity to prevent the worst of those impacts from coming to be. Next slide. So next week during the stakeholder breakouts, we'll be discussing strategies to address this conifer expansion challenge. And we just wanted to seed some ideas, food for thought over the course of the next week for that discussion. Some of the things we need to figure out as part of the strategy is how do we scale up targeted management to outpace expansion? How do we incorporate priority areas for other sagebrush species beyond sage-grouse? How do we address woodland change holistically across entire watersheds? In other words, right now we're focused on that red box where expansion into shrublands is problematic. But what about the natural PJ woodlands that are also being impacted by that change and maybe affecting habitat for our woodland dependent species like pinyon jay? We need a plan from ridgetop to valley bottoms to make sure that we're being holistic. Also, Americans love trees, and so anything we do on the land that removes trees can sometimes be controversial. So we need to be talking about improving the awareness of how this is a problem and really garnering support for the type of work we're doing and showing the outcomes of those efforts. It's really important to sustain the funding for ongoing management. We've done well over the last 10 years, but we need to keep that going. And alongside management, we need to support that co-produced science, where we partner researchers up with managers to learn as we go and document the outcomes of our actions and also help adaptively manage in the face of what will be continued uncertainty. And then finally, we want to stress our best practices for mitigating the risks of cheatgrass and climate change that we know will continue to affect all of our landscapes. So with that, Susan, I will turn it back over to you.
All right, thank you very much, Jeremy. Great presentation. And I am looking now, we do have a couple minutes here that we could take some questions. So I'm looking to see if we have any questions submitted or if I see any hands raised. We'll take just a pause here to see if anyone would have a question for you.